At the University of Regina, the Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Digital Resource Hub showcases impactful EDI initiatives across the campus.
It's a centralized, accessible resource for our community and post-secondary institutions nationally.
Join us to hear the stories behind the initiatives shaping our campus.
Okay, my work, that's my PhD work, sits in between theatre and political science, and my research engages race and racism, and I'm using site-specific performance, as a tool to critically discuss lots of socio-political discussions, that has been happening. And again, in the area of political science, I'm looking at the whole idea around multiculturalism and whether multiculturalism is truly a melting pot for most cultural identities. So, and for me, the reason why site-specific performance is really important, especially in the area of theatre, is because it's oftentimes easy for people to see theatre as entertainment, but then there's something about site-specific performance that takes people to spaces where some incidents occurred, and when audience are made to go into some of these spaces and not removed from these spaces through performances happening proscenium theatre, the impact is more. The impact of the theatre is much more felt, and I'm focusing my attention on the Nigerian community. And the reason why I decided to focus my attention on the Nigerian community started around 2022, when I wrote my first play, actually my second play, Rites of Passage. And Rites of Passage discusses experience of immigrants, and the culture shock that they experience, and by the time they're in the country, things they need, the ways they navigate the society. I just suppose this with issues Africa face in and especially in African countries, and aside that performance, I also did another performance titled Off Guard, where I was made to really dig deep into experiences of Black students in Canadian universities. I was looking at, what are the experiences of racism in universities? Has anything really been done? And if they've been done, what impact does it have on the society? What impact does it have on the community? What impact does it have on the university and also the student itself? And the reason why I decided to do that was because when I was going through my research and ethics application, I actually wanted to interview Black students at the University of Regina, but the research fell flat because students were afraid to get interviewed because of repercussions and all, despite assuring them that their identity will be protected, And I decided to not, after doing all this wide research on students through performance, I decided to streamline my focus to the Nigerian society, whom I understand really well, to start looking at, what is the experience of racism, especially going back to people that came here early, as far back as 50 years ago, down to people right now, for example, in high school, and also what's the whole, and also race relation, how do they engage with other races? And is Canada truly a place where they feel among, or is it a place that further, promotes this division amongst races? And that's why I said that my research sort of aligns also with the research going on in political science about multiculturalism being a melting pot. Yeah. Well, I know that there are lots of projects, very fantastic ones really, being done by the Center for Socially Engaged Theatre by Professor Taiwo Afolabi. But then what I would like to touch on is the merger between town and gown. and that's currently happening in the university. And I would like to mention specifically the works that Professor James Dashok at the Faculty of Humanities is doing. So, a Faculty of Kinesiology. And what I really like about what he's doing is bringing research that has been done in the community to play in the academic classrooms. And for example, when we did From the Margins, so From the Margins is a documentary about anti-Black racism in Saskatchewan, and it was produced by me at the by Commonwealth Community Arts. And what happened in the film was us looking at generational approach to what people faced, and we interviewed Carola Boyd. I think she's currently 82 right now, and she's one of the descendants of the, I think, second generation of Blacks in Saskatchewan, to get our own view, what racism was like when she was there. And what we discovered from that film is that, there's really nothing seriously that has changed, but things have gotten worse. And when we wanted to premiere the film, we invited Professor James Dashok and members of the university community to come and see the film. And they really loved it. And James Dashok invited me to preview the film in one of his class, and another professor also invited, And from the preview and the workshop, there were lots of awareness, and also from the feedback forms, there were many people, because when I was reviewing the feedback form, that really discovered the microaggressions, that they didn't really know were microaggressions, and the subtle ways, racism occurs in the society, through compliments, for example, for example, just touching, the mere act of touching someone's hair, I like your hair, and all those compliments that are warranted, So people started understanding through these films, and some people didn't even know that racism occurred in high schools, especially with teachers, how teachers relate with students, how Black students are being victimized, and what is even happening in the northern communities, Saskatchewan, for example, in Prince Albert, So these are the kinds of stuff, currently happening at the university, which I really like, and I hope that this kind of workshops can continue, because there's something spectacular about the arts, film, theater, whatever, that, no matter what you read in the book, you cannot visualize it so well than what you see in the films, or theater, because it stays in the memory. And these are some of the important things, trying to tell people, okay, these are the ways these things are happening. And there was someone especially that has been facing racism in a place of work, but she didn't know how to address it. And after the workshop at the Faculty of Kinesiology, she told me that she's going to approach a boss, because she's been trying to cover it up. She's not talking because, again, she's afraid, and she's afraid that she's really going to get sacked, or something's going to happen. And really, those are one of the things that are happening to the Blacks in Regina, because, for example, if you come here as an international student, one of the fear is going back to your country. And many people have sacrificed so much to come here. And for her, she just discovered, man, this thing is really affecting my mental health. And mental health really is something that Blacks don't like talking about. And whenever we refer to that, especially as a Nigerian, there's always something that God forbids. So right now, giving the space for people to talk about these issues is really important. And I believe that the university should continue to promote the merger between town and gown, because no matter what you write about in the academics or in the school or anything, no matter the thesis you publish, if it's not directly applicable in the community, it's dead on arrival. Yeah. Positive outcomes sometimes, especially in the area of theatre, is always difficult to measure quantitatively. So I'll just speak about some qualitative outcomes. So I remember when I first presented my play, so my professors and the department, the faculty of MAP, has been really supportive, and I must really mention here, people like Professor Kathleen Erwin, Christine Gamze, Professor Sarah Abbott, and other people, and they've been really supportive. And my play sort of has opened a new vista for learning where they're starting to see some sort of information or things they didn't know about racism or about the Black community itself, Because I remember when I staged Rites of Passage, and I mentioned how African applications, immigrant applications, have been over-scrutinized. And then someone in the audience told me that, man, that I never knew that this application your applications were being scrutinized like this, and he said he was going to look into it, And I remember that there were some issues. I wouldn't like to say the department right now, that the students were having issues with a certain professor. And then someone that attended the play, who is also a professor at the university, promised to look into it. So, but for example, I don't know what has happened after that, but just that awareness, and the fact that you were going to look into what's happening. And for example, James Dasher that I said actually came to one of my plays. It was for one of the plays that he saw me and he just took interest in the work. And he just told me, Buku, how do I, I'm doing this course and I really want people to really open up. And I told him from the meeting I had with him that, the way Black people that I know specifically can open up is if they report things anonymously. And how anonymous can anonymous be? And bringing people that understand them, and would ensure that nothing is going to happen to them, And I was so happy that someone as good as that and as knowledgeable as that, decided to take my advice. And that was why he decided to come to the screening of the film and decided to, bring the film to the class. Those are some positive outcomes. Another positive outcome is also during a play where one student, really decided that, a lecturer intentionally marked him down. Is at the Department of Engineering, and he didn't want to take the matter up, And in the play, there was one character that was hounded by the university lecturer and everything, and he told me after the performance that what you represented on stage is what's happening to me currently at the Department of Engineering, and he said, I think I need to take this matter up, And that's really interesting and very, it's a really good outcome for me, a positive one really at that. And there are many things, but there are many
instances,
positive outcomes in the community, but I'll just stick to the one at the university. I would approach the challenges, especially from my experience with my research. And I would like to just focus on the research and ethics board application, because for any project to do well, it starts with, especially research that has to do with human participants. It has to do with, it starts from that research ethics board application. And I feel there needs to be an Afrocentric approach. There needs to be an Afrocentric approach to research that deals with racism and research that has to do with Black people. And okay, so in 2022, when I was doing an ethnography work at the university where I applied to the research and ethics board, with all the whole process and all those things. And I wanted to study, like I said before, I wanted to study students, University of Virginia students and their experience of racism, especially the Black community. And I came up with 4-page of application, 4-page of consent form. And I told them that this research will be dead on arrival. Why? Black people are normally afraid of contracts like this. I told my supervisor, when I would take this consent form to these people, and I can assure you that they are not going to sign it, because by the time they are reading, they think something else is there, It's just like the way we are afraid of police and we can't look at the police in the eye, sort of. And it's just a culture thing. And I feel, and by the time I took these forms to people that in a way had told me what they experienced unofficially, they rejected. In fact, someone called his dad from Ghana, and the dad told them that, no, don't sign the form. You don't know who will look at it. You can't trust the university and all those things. And the dad told him that just anything you're facing in the department, just take it in. Don't bother about it. So I stopped the research, and I told my professor at that time that, you see, I told you this form is not going to go anywhere. And that was how I decided to focus on the larger Black community and looking at credible resources of mine that I could find of Black students in Canadian universities across different provinces. Now, why is this important? Is that at the level of research ethics application that ought to guard EDI projects, that process in itself, coming up with lots of risks and all those factors, I understand that those things are meant to safeguard participants and researchers, and also ensure that researchers do works ethically. But then that process in itself is barring people from talking about their experiences. And it's because I feel that some people that are involved do not understand the the African experience of racism and how they come and how these things play out. And I'm also facing it right now because my PhD is on Nigerian community. And I've come up with a 4-page consent from after back and forth. I was even frustrated. And right now, people are also afraid to sign the form. Now, if we are to really go deeper, if we are to really strengthen EDI in the faculty and in the institution, we need to do that. We need to focus on the process of research ethics application. We need to reduce it. And when I spoke with some researchers in Toronto, in Vancouver, they told me something that after that their university also faces that their university, but in a way, they come up with their own 2-page form for people to sign because they know that participants are always afraid to sign that 4-page form. So what's the essence of the process if people are really afraid to sign that form? And so for me, that's the ethics form, in a way, even though it's protecting the participants, has stopped the real stories from coming out. And I had to abandon it. I didn't tell those people stories. Until now, I can't tell their stories because I'm not officially allowed to do so. So there are a lot of stories hidden in the university that people can't say because of fear of repercussion. And again, because of fear of this 4-page consent form, or only God knows how many pages of consent form that comes for people to sign. So really, people, for example, let me talk about my own department. People that understand performance, that understand theater, need to be in the research and ethics board, because there is a different way a theater performance goes or a theater research goes that other research don't operate. And there's a different way that Black research operates that a research about white or any other culture doesn't operate like that. So if you use one stone, if you use one approach for everything, almost all research is going to fall flat. For me, equity, diversity, and inclusion is good, but it's not going to happen without action. So for people watching this, I would just advise, be intentional about creating communities, about speaking to people, because Canada is so multicultural, but then everyone really seems to be in their silos, their bubbles. So just be intentional, Anybody you meet out there today, just speak to them. Ask them how you are, and just the simple question of good morning, hope everything is going on well with you, goes a long way in really accomplishing what ADI means, because there are lots of misconceptions about people's culture, people's ideologies out there, and it can only happen when people speak out.